All right, it looks like we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy day to join us. My name is Lindsay Culberth, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Kirkpatrick Price and your moderator for today's session. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Auditor Insight webinar on the top 3 issues with your risk assessment. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees will be muted throughout the session, but if you have questions, please add those to the questions box and we will address those at the end of the presentation. Also, if you would like CPE credit for the session, you can send an email to hello@kirkpatrickprice.com and we will happily send that your way. And finally, this session is being recorded and we will send a link to all attendees tomorrow. So be on the lookout in your inbox for a copy of this webinar. At Kirkpatrick Price, we know that when it comes to threats, you want to make sure that you're ready. In order to do that, you need quality cybersecurity and compliance audit reports with results you can trust. The problem is that audits are hard because the process is complicated and it feels overwhelming. But we know if you're going to do it, the audit should be worth it. We've been in your shoes and we know how hard audits can be, but we've issued over 10,000 reports to 1,200 clients worldwide, giving them the assurance they deserve. We'd like to encourage you to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our monthly newsletter, The Readiness Report, so that we can partner with you to help you meet your challenging compliance goals. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome today's speaker. Shannon Lane has over 20 years of experience in information services, including healthcare IT, e-commerce data extrapolation, network administration, database administration, and external audit work. He now serves as a lead practitioner at Kirkpatrick Price and holds CISSP, CISA, QSA, and CCSFP certifications. Shannon is located in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Welcome to the webinar, Shannon.
Hi there, folks. It's good to meet all of you. All right. When management came to me and asked me to join this webinar series and talking about the things that we learn in the field, I was the one that raised the idea of talking about risk assessment. We all know that risk assessment is foundational. We all know that risk assessment is a requirement. I've heard it called the most necessary of evils, in fact. And what I want to talk to you guys today are about the common failings I see, especially at the governance level with risk assessment, and how we can take risk assessment and leverage it into something far grander for an organization, far more useful, and a control that you'll actually be excited to run. I know, bear with me, we'll do our best. The other thing we're going to do today is we're going to torture a metaphor. We're going to start by talking about Roman gods. I'm not sure that you all came to this expecting to get a quick education in Roman gods, but I like this one. This fellow's name is Janus. He's named after, January is named after this god. He's the god of beginnings, gates, transitions, passages, frames, and endings. What a god to be. I have always been fond of Janus because he presides over change. The ancient Romans knew that change was so significant, so important. This idea that things never stay the same was so big, they gave him a god. He looks 2 directions because on the one side, he looks to the vision of the future. He plans ahead. He sees what's coming on the road. And in the other, standing at the threshold, he looks behind to see the road that led to where they are, that informs the decisions are getting made going forward. He was, believe it or not, a major god of the Romans. And while I'm no mythological expert, as far as I understand it, there isn't a god prior to this that matches quite the same place in the pantheon. Janus is pretty unique. And that makes sense, coming as it does from a nation of administration, a nation of organizers and doers. In fact, you can take that metaphor of the idea of business as sort of the Romans, and you can take it a little bit farther. I've heard business described in 1,000 different ways, and there's all these 2 category ways you can divide up business, but this one is my favorite. Business is really divided into two verticals. You have visionaries. This is your CEO, your CTO, your CIO. Sales and marketing support this side of the business. They are the people that look forward, that set the course of the march, that plan the campaign, that aim the company in a direction. And their ultimate goal is to do everything they can to figure out what's next. And then on the other half of the coin, you have guardians. This is your CFO, your CISO, your COO. They're supported by groups like IT and HR and finance and operations. These protect the march. They ensure that it's supplied and maintained and that decisions are made with the right data. Are things working as you intended them to work? Are we managing our assets correctly? Are we going the right direction? Risk assessment, and hear me out here because you're not going to believe me right off the bat, risk assessment is ultimately designed to bring these two groups together so that they understand each other. In fact, a great risk assessment, a really good risk assessment, does a lot of stuff. It sets milestones, objectives, and tasks. It fixes a common language around risk that both sides of this equation can speak. It leads to a complete understanding of the operating environment and why we do things. And it shows how the different groups are interrelated in actually achieving a primary goal. Preparation is what risk assessment is about. Preparation is the key element of risk assessment. In fact, I'm very fond of children's books. One of my favorite is Norman Juster's The Phantom Tollbooth. There's more wisdom in that book, I swear. As I get older, I find out I learn more from it every time I go back and read it. But one of my favorite quotes from that book is, "Expect everything, I always say, and the unexpected never happens." And at the end of the day, that's the goal of the risk assessment. It's to bring all of the voices in your company together and to figure out what to expect and how often you can expect it and how good or bad it is that that thing comes to pass. To really torture this metaphor, this idea of the Roman campaign, we don't embark on a journey without planning, direction, equipment, and contingency planning. We just don't. And risk assessment is the key business activity used to ensure that we're ready for the journey, we understand the trail, and we're ready to face the dangers on it. Now, the thing about that is I talk very pie in the sky, very openly about risk assessment. You might even say I'm a bit of a fan, but I'm not the only one that talks about risk assessment. It's so fundamental to the information security and governance process that every single major governance or information security framework requires a risk assessment. All of them do. Sarbanes-Oxley does, HIPAA does, but just to pick on three in particular, the SOC 2 uses it drives 4 COSO principles off of risk assessment. The PCI DSS only drives 1, but remember, miss any one in PCI DSS and you fail, and their requirement for it is pretty significant for all that it's a single line item. NIST 853, one of our core information security guidelines or frameworks, has an entire category of the entire assessment related to risk assessment. The RA control category is nothing but risk assessment, with enhancements that drive to even bigger risk assessment based on your company's base risk. Every single framework agrees risk assessment is key. The SEC says risk assessment is key. The CMS organization says risk assessment is key. And yet, when I go out on an audit, and it's my client's first time, the very first time we go out, I've invariably asked the question, why do we even need this thing? Why is it important? Why is mine not good enough? Invariably, it's one of the major findings for the very first time at audit. That comes down to 3 key misses. There are 3 things that happen before the risk assessment is even performed that causes an organization to completely miss the requirements that are laid out in every one of these frameworks, or to even use the control in a substantial fashion. I'm going to take a minute and we're going to go through these, because if you agree with my why, these are actually the root causes of a risk assessment fault or exception. It's not what you think either. The three misses that I always see are almost never at the nuts and bolts level of doing a risk assessment. The mere act of doing a risk assessment, right or wrong, correct modeling or incorrect modeling, is far less important than actually hitting some key governance concepts. And the first one is sword points. Again, I warned you, we were torturing a metaphor here today. Sword points are those things that we do as an organization that are required to have by other organizations, the regulatory agencies, frameworks, all the other stuff. These are the things that we have to do or we get in trouble. Now, here's the funny thing about risk assessment. When I sit down with the CEO and we have a conversation and I ask them sideways questions about risks, hey, what do you see as problems in the next year for your organization? What are you worried about? What keeps you up at night? We have a discussion about risk. They're doing risk assessment. When I sit down with operations leaders and I talk about SLAs and KPIs, and we sit down and we actually dig into why they exist and what they're covering, they're doing risk assessment. IT can usually bring me an asset-based risk assessment. I understand what these are, and we've got business impact analysis, and we understand, at least from a DR perspective, how all of our systems fit together and what's important. And that too is risk assessment. Risk assessment is an activity that every business does all the time. But the minute somebody tells you you have to make it a formal process and you got to sit and write it down, you got to do all these forms, it becomes like doing income taxes. We do grudging compliance. It becomes a thing that happens, and yeah, we do it and whatever. And it's just a careless implementation of the entire process that leads to big gaps in risk assessment that ultimately lead to the failure of the control. In truth, considered deliberate action always leads to real understanding, but that's not often what we do when people tell us to do something. The second big one is halfway. So I'll often go into companies where the risk assessment is a thrown together document that was done in a back room on somebody's computer 20 minutes before the audit. And yeah, it's fine because it talks about our risks, but it wasn't really a process. It wasn't really integrated, and that's a problem. But then you get the other ones that are truly mystified when I start picking on them for the risk assessment. And these are the ones that did half of a risk assessment, maybe a third. I walk into the environment and I get a beautiful risk assessment from the CISO and from the CTO from an IT perspective. I know all the risks that they're worried about, like hackers and intrusion events, and I see downtime risks. Anything that has to do with sort of the staying up and running version of technology. That's the one that everybody gets right first. And the reason behind that is a lot of times client compliance is being driven by a framework that is fundamentally a function of those roles. So they think about it from their roles and their perspectives. But in most businesses, that's only 40% of your business. Maybe less. I almost never see in that first year risk assessments that talk about internal threat, fraud risk, competitive risk, key man vulnerabilities. Is there somebody in your company that if they left tomorrow, you would be absolutely terrified of continuing the next day? What are you doing about that? That's a risk that needs to be established in a risk assessment. What about your market risk? What about your retention risk? What's HR been telling you guys? Is your corporate culture doing okay? Risk is so much more than just, is my computer up? Risk needs to be holistic and whole company. And as per usual, I had a grandfather that on his farm in northern Tennessee had the best saying for it. He told me this when I was 9 years old, and when I was eating an apple and I wanted to put it away for later. And he said, eating only half an apple lets half rot and doesn't make you less hungry. They don't last long once you start in on them. That's true of risk too. If you only do half your risk assessment, if you only establish half your risk formally or less, That's not a good risk assessment. That's not something that's going to help you in the future. It barely gets you over some basic principles in the frameworks. And it certainly doesn't drive you to good governance. The third big fault I run into some companies out there who the very first time, they're very proud when we come in and I look at them and go, great, you've talked to me about fraud, and great, you've got the whole company on board and everybody's excited about doing it. And I ask the question, tell me what these words mean. And they don't really have an answer. Now, for those of you that are thinking about risk assessment for the first time, and when I say that, you didn't immediately nod, most risk assessment is not quantitative. That is to say, you can do risk assessment that's purely driven by the financial numbers of the organization. There are ways to assign value to a risk. However, most organizations, even very large organizations, do not actually do risk assessment in that way. It's incredibly time consuming, usually requires actuarial level competencies that are just not present in most organizations. And there's a sort of devotion to numbers at that point that doesn't necessarily flow anywhere outside of the CFO's office. No offense to any CFOs that might be listening. But most organizations do what's called a qualitative analysis. You take impact and likelihood of a given risk, and you talk about how much you've mitigated it, and you use expressions like, oh, that's a high impact or moderate likelihood, and you cross-reference these things to figure out how important a risk is. But there are organizations where I sit down and I say, so what's a high risk? And every department in the organization will tell me a different definition for high. And so we have a risk assessment that is filled with incomparables. If we all have different definitions, if we're not actually working the program, if we don't get together and establish how we're going to talk about risk as a community, as an organization, then everybody talks about it a different way, and everybody's risk is absolutely crazy high, and everything is an emergency, and that's not a risk assessment. Conversely, you get those organizations that are so lackadaisical about risk that they don't recognize they have a major problem staring them in the face, because every risk isn't, oh no, that's no big deal. We don't care about that. It's fine. We've got that covered. To illustrate this point, I want you guys to do something with me here. I want you to think of the color green. Close your eyes for just a second and think of the color green. Now, hold that color that you thought of in your brain, and let me ask you, was it Kelly green? Was it neon green? Was it frog green? Was it grass green? Green covers a multitude of sins. Do you really think you thought of the same color green that I did? And just in case you're curious about that one, I thought about the color of a green ocean. I'm a diver, that's kind of where that goes. If we don't establish common definitions, why are we even doing the risk assessment in the first place? So those are the big drivers of risk assessment failure. It's not, are you doing ISO 27005 or NIST 833, or did you do something from the BSA Alliance, or none of that is the important bit. No, people fail because they're made to do it and don't want to, so they don't do it well, or because they do it halfway because only the IT guys are actually interested in engaging with the process and they do it really good and then everything else gets left behind. Or when they actually do get everybody together and do it, they just kind of make up things as they go along and everybody has a different perception of the process and it ends up being kind of just a big giant mess. It looks good on paper, but it doesn't mean anything when we dig into it. So how do you solve it? How do we take those three faults that we see, and how do I teach you guys to actually engage with and do a risk assessment that has meaning and function and substance inside of your organization? Let's give it a try. The first step is I want everybody to commit. From all of the executives and department heads, it's every person in management in that organization needs to have a commitment to actually do this thing. Instead of thinking it as something you have to do, think of it as something you get to do and engage with it in that way. Bring in every department in your organization. Make a day of it. It takes about a day to do all of the background work for risk assessment. Maybe a little longer if you have a complex organization. Then you have everybody do homework and they bring the homework to the risk assessment meeting. But make it an engaging experience. Make it something everybody's committed to. Make it something everybody understands is important and that there's expectation to engage with the process. I cannot stress enough how much a culture of security matters. And I'm going to tell everyone on this call, if you take nothing else away from this, the mere act of expressing this, we are committed to our risks, understanding them and communicating about them, and we're going to do something about them every year. That alone speaks volumes to your company's culture and how it engages with security and operational infrastructure. The second part, don't just do it. Don't run into that meeting without knowing what you're doing. Pick a leader, make sure that they understand it. Pick a risk framework and work with it. Take the time to establish all of your definitions that you're going to talk about up front and train everybody on them. We're going to do a risk assessment. When we say hi, guys, we mean this. When we say there's a high impact or a high likelihood or a low impact or a low likelihood, we mean this. And when you're doing mitigation, we're going to do it like this. And we mean this when we say it. If everyone works from the same workbook, if everyone agrees on the fundamental classifications that you're using in your risk assessment, then there's something magic that happens in a risk assessment. There's something truly amazing that occurs. The output, the risk register you create at the end of your risk assessment process, the output becomes a list of comparing things that you normally couldn't compare. You begin to understand things like, how important are my door locks? What risks do they actually cover? How big are those risks? Why is my IT guy asking me for so much backup stuff? Oh, because he's covering that major risk that we see of outage. Our SLAs are too short. We can't have any outage. We have to be high availability, and that has this cost. You get to see how everything fits together and what actually really is important, divorcing everybody's feelings about what's important, but to actually see what really is important inside of an organization and where you still have work to do. The next part is cyclical engagement. Risk assessments are living. People get together and they do this process, and everybody gets all excited about doing the process, and then they forget they've got to do it every year. That it doesn't work to just do it once and forget about it. And you need to engage with it all through the year. It should be a living document where people, when they find a new risks, are attaching it to the risk assessment and saying, hey, we found this thing and we think it needs to fit in the risk framework. Hey, we uncovered this problem. Hey, we identified this new system and it's got these new risks associated with it. Hey, I read this article on SANS and it said this, or I read this article in my trade magazine and it said this. Bringing those into your risk assessment means that you're ready to do future planning on them. You can engage with them as they are and then revisit them each year. And you get to ask questions like, hey, did we make progress on this? Did we fix that? Did we hit those milestones we were talking about in sales that were so important to hit this year? Hey, that HR problem we had, did we get that fixed? Hey, wait a minute, that log4j problem that just popped up, that was a really big deal. Are we sure we got everything covered? Now, my favorite piece of the puzzle comes in here. You would think I'm a big fan of everything else, but I get to be a really big fan of risk assessment in my own organizations that I've used over the years, where I've worked with them over the years, at this phase, because this becomes part of an annual budget conversation. IT can finally justify to finance exactly why they do all the things they do. And sales can ask for new tools because there's a new risk associated with it that they need a new tool to cover. Or design can come forth and say, hey, we need to be cutting edge and here are the tools we need to do that. And everybody can start having a conversation from the perspective of, that's where you want to go. Those are the pitfalls along the way, and this is what I need to bridge them. But that only works when everybody has the same definitions for risk. You bring operational risk into the risk assessment, and you do it every year so that you can talk about how things are going at a very gross and macro scale, and everybody can get on the same page. And then step 4, check in. It can't be something you just do at a big event every year, though you have to do it at a big event every year. Instead, check in throughout the year, quarterly meetings maybe where the executives get together and, hey, pull out the risk assessment, say, how are we doing? Report in on your milestones and touch points that you guys figured out at the last risk assessment as your follow-ups to that. Make sure everybody stays on the same page. But most importantly, call out milestones that get hit to the whole organization. Hey, this is a big deal. We crossed this threshold. We made it over this pothole. We've covered this problem that we foresaw. It's that sets up the culture of watching out for risk, that lets everybody feel comfortable in coming to talk to management about things that they see coming on the horizon, about the journey you're undertaking. If you want a culture of security, this is where it begins. And that's the thought I really want to drive home here, guys. We talk a good game about risk assessment, and I'm talking a good game about risk assessment at a very high level, talking to C-suite officers and organizational members that want to use this in a good way. If you want to know the truth, the biggest thing I run across in an audit is the fact that security controls like risk assessment aren't fully leveraged. I'm giving away some of my trade secrets here and my easy recommendations, but it really comes down to this. Every time you have a required activity, anytime you have something you have to do, there's usually a silver lining, a gem hiding underneath it of a lot of power and capability and potential for an organization if you embrace the thing it's asking you to do. Business, like any other thing that's been around for as long as business has been around, a lot of the bugs we already know, a lot of the features we already know, a lot of the necessary activity has been enshrined in regulation and law, and then we push back against it because it was enshrined in regulation and law and best practice manuals and all the stuff you're supposed to do. But there's a reason that risk is a big discussion in an MBA class. It's because understanding and establishing risk does far more than just understand risk. It establishes your culture. Who are you listening to? Who do you care about? What's important in the organization? It establishes your funding. Hey, CFO, here are the risks we've got to cover. These people are going to come to you with directives against that risk, and you're going to have to work with them on how we're going to pay for it, and how we're going to drive to it. What do our expenses look like because of it? It drives a culture of inclusivity. Everyone in your organization gets to understand what everybody else is doing and why it matters. Because visionaries have to express their vision, along with all the problems they see along the way. And operations guys have to tell you what's going on in the ops department so that they can get it fixed, or they can drive against problems they're having, or they can future-proof what you guys are trying to build. IT guys and HR can come sit at the same table and discuss things using common parameters. And at the end of the day, your organization comes together around this and the other required elements of an assessment. The power in risk assessment, weirdly enough, isn't just risk, but community and culture. So I think I said this before, but I'm going to say it again. If I sound passionate about this, I am. And if you all take nothing else away from this entire conversation, take this away. Risk assessment is fundamental to business for a reason. Risk assessment drives good business practice. And above all, risk assessment is sort of an inventory of understanding across your organization, something that can really help you get down in the weeds and understand what's going on and what you're preparing for. It is, in my opinion, the single most important cross-business task that gets done, short of producing a P&L or a balance sheet. So with that said, we're going to open the floor to questions. Do you guys have any questions for me coming to this? Remember, put them into your chat box, and we'll try to address all the questions that we can in the time that we have remaining. So let me know.
All right, Shannon, we've got a few for you. The first one, I feel like is a great segue from something you just talked about. And we've got a question that says, how do you suggest getting a C-suite member on board for a risk assessment when they do not care about compliance?
That is always a tough question. My answer for you on that is, if they don't care about compliance, then that can't be your driving sales point for a risk assessment. Honest to goodness, if that's not what they care about at the end of the day, if your CEO is looking at you going, I got to do that compliance thing, but I don't care about it, then the answer to that should be, well, good. Let's not talk about it for compliance reasons then. Let's talk about it for budget. Do they care about budget? Is that their big driver? Maybe what they care about is realizing their vision. They've got this giant vision that they're chasing down, and they really want to be in the middle of that vision and look at them and go, well, I want to help you get there. Come do a risk assessment with me. Let's see if we can figure out how to get you there from here. Maybe you do it from the perspective of board and shareholder reporting. I don't know what's important to your organization, but I worked with an organization in the past where the CEO couldn't care less about compliance, but what he had to say to the board was a big deal, and we were able to demonstrate that the risk assessment crystallized the message he could give to the board. When he handed the board a full-on risk assessment for the year and was talking about how they were going to spend money, that was a great conversation piece. But just going in front of him talking about how they wanted to spend money, he didn't get a lot of traction for the things he wanted. There is, I don't know if all of you have heard about COBIT, but COBIT uses risk assessment for that purpose. The idea behind risk assessment is that becomes a driver for expense reporting, and it trains IT guys to speak about risk in financial terms. If nothing else, driving down the financial side of the fence is often a good way to get there. As a CISO, as a compliance guy, I get stuck sometimes on, well, we got to do it for compliance reasons. But honestly, that's not the best reason to do it. The compliance folks are just holding your feet to the fire on something you should have been doing ahead of time. So what are the should have been doings? Their budget, their conversation, their understanding, their visionary, their all of the other pieces of the puzzle.
Great. So the next one that has come in, we've got several, so I'm going to try and get through these. We are seeing an increase in requests to provide our internal risk assessments to our customers, who are mostly banks. We have no intention of doing so, but are others seeing the same?
I see that a lot. There are even frameworks like HITRUST that are rising up to kind of address that particular concern. Different industries address that in different ways. Healthcare, for example, usually doesn't request your risk assessment. They request proof that you've done one. That is a little different. Maybe you use board reporting or another piece. But the risk assessment is getting to the point where it's getting a lot more focus. And let me express that in a different way, and then we'll get back to the original answer. Use FTX as your guiding light on this one. FTX failed due to a lack of corporate control, which included things like risk assessment as part of that particular piece. Now, their corporate control failures were way bigger than anything a risk assessment was going to solve, don't get me wrong. But the reason you're seeing so many people ask that question is because they want to know that you're controlling the company, and the risk assessment is the best way to express that control. They want to see, when you talk to a bank, they want to see that you're addressing fraud and third party and know your customer and all the rest of the things that you may have to do for them. So I am seeing a lot more financial institutions ask for risk assessments, and they're not backing down, which I find pretty fascinating. Sometimes you can push back against those entities and say, I don't want to give you that. But you know what? A lot of times they're just asking for them anyway. I'm not sure where that market trend is going to go, but maybe coming at it from the understanding of they want you to demonstrate corporate control, that's what they're really looking for, might help as you guys are formulating what you want to do to respond to them on that vertical.
All right, the next one is who's going to drive this exercise? If there are different departments, there will be different perspectives coming from different departments. How do you handle that?
Okay, this is where I'm going to put on my I've been down in the trenches hat one too many times. There are only two departments that can drive a risk assessment. And I'm being blunt here for a reason, and that is because those departments have unique perspectives on risk. And those two departments being the drivers, meaning being the project manager, the compiler, the one that acts as the MC at the front of the room, right? Those two departments are your information technology vertical, usually through your information security professional, or your CFO through finance. And the reason is those are the two entities in your organization. IT guys get a thorough grounding in risk from the beginning, and the folks that are running departments really have to know this stuff. So they're pretty good to be able to drive it based on like a NIST framework or an ISO framework pretty quickly, or to get up to speed on those frameworks very, very quickly. And the CFO is doing this every single day. They're just doing it with numbers. So it's very easy for them to transition to sort of a non-number look at the entire environment. But those are the two quote unquote guardians in the organization that have the best holistic view of how risk works. Your COO, your operations chief, might be another great choice, especially if they're really good at this stuff. If they've got great KPIs, if they really understand the risks of operation, if they're really doing it, they might be a really good driver for it. I'm going to say this, and if there are CEOs on this call, I'm terribly sorry that I'm saying this, but CEOs are terrible drivers of this exercise. When you are a visionary, it is very easy to discount concerns. And that's the one thing you can't do during a risk assessment. They have to be organically discounted by actually figuring out what the real impact is. You can't let anything not go on the risk assessment just because you don't feel like you want it today. And unfortunately, the visionary groups in an organization tend to do that. So it's going to come from the ops side of the fence, usually IT, IS, or finance, with a good backup in your operations team. Find the people most fascinated with risk and get them together to learn how to do it and have them pull the whole thing together to make it run.
So piggybacking off that, the question is, who should I include in my risk assessment process?
You're going to hate this. This is the auditor's weasel answer, and it depends. But let's start by saying it depends with a big giant asterisk on the far right of it. You should have a representative from IT, full stop. I don't care how big your company is. I don't care if what you have is 2 IT guys. And I mean IT. You notice I'm not saying information security or your information team or your CTO. You need a member of IT in the room. It's not for the reasons that you think. It is because at the end of the day, the IT department is going to be responsible for implementing 3/4 of what you come up with, and their perspective on what's mitigating things out there tends to be more universal than the rest of your team. You're going to want your CFO or your controller, because if you don't have finance speaking, you don't have a voice. The risk assessment loses its punch. You need a CEO. I hate to say the CEOs, you really do need to play, because you need the vision. If you don't have the forward vision, you don't have a full risk assessment. You need your director of sales. Now, they're going to be very upset to have to go to this meeting, but they're the ones that have an idea of what's going on in the market, where your weaknesses are in your product, against your competitive risk. And those are things that you probably should bring up for your risk assessment. You need someone from your operations team. What's going on out there in the world? And what are we doing? And what risks have you already covered? And what do we need to cover? And you need HR. So if it sounds like I just said you need a representative from every major department in your company, you need a representative from every major department in your company, and you need someone with decision-making capability that can speak for the whole team. Now, if your organization is very large, and I'm actually going to classify very large for this conversation at a far smaller number than you might be expecting, 150 people or bigger. There's actual science behind that number, but if you're 150 people or bigger in your organization, then you need to break this process up and give homework ahead of time. Those representatives need to come with sort of a preliminary risk assessment from their teams to the risk assessment meeting. They got to come with having done it with their group and then bring what their group said to the meeting, or you're just going to spend a week doing this and go nowhere without representing the whole company. 150 not people, by the way, and I could do a whole seminar on this, but 150 people is what's called a Dunbar number. That's at the point you no longer know every other person in the company. So that's when you need to start breaking it up by department and having them come really prepped. Hopefully you've got your risk assessment running before then.
Now that we know who should be included, we have a question of how do we know how shallow or how deep to drive the risk assessment analysis and solutions so that we either don't waste time or don't do too little?
It is more art than science in that department. However, my guideline is if you wouldn't bring it to the C-suite, it doesn't belong in the risk assessment conversation at the level we're talking about. Now, every department has its own set of risks, and every department has its own mitigations. And I am one of those people that does risk assessments all the way down. There are risks that are purely in department and risks that are company-wide. And knowing where those two distinctions are is important. And there's nothing wrong with each department going through this exercise and identifying like little internal risks, like I've got a closet that's disastrous. I'm an IT guy, guys, so we're gonna go with that. I've got a closet that's in disastrous shape and I need time to fix that. That's probably not a surfaced company-wide level risk, but it's definitely one I need to address over the course of my operations for the next year. But think of it from a macro scale. What are the things that if they occur could actually cause real damage to the organization? A messy closet is not going to do that. But maybe I've got one developer who really understands my entire stack and none of the other ones really have that understanding. So I have a key man vulnerability. That probably needs to be surfaced because I need budget. And that's kind of my internal barometer. If the risk you're talking about either consumes or requires budget, it probably needs to be surfaced up at the top level of the meeting. If it is incidental expense or already spoken for in like OpEx, then no, probably not. But things like I need 2 FTEs to retrain or to get some knowledge out of a developer so that we can cover what he knows and we can make sure that we've got, that's a big deal. And it's definitely something that should be put out there and your progress should be measured on it. I hope that helped. If you would like more on that, reach out through Lindsay, whoever's asking this question, and I will be more than happy to either do a second webinar if there's enough interest in that, or to just sit down with you and give you a more thorough discussion based on the size of your organization.
All right, next up, we got a lot of questions coming in. There is a difference between a security risk assessment versus compliance assessment. Can you elaborate on the two and offer your views?
I can, but I'm going to do it from a HIPAA perspective. So for those of you that are doing other compliance frameworks, follow along and just substitute your name in place for each one. A security risk assessment is directed wholly against the security apparatus of an organization. Now, that security apparatus is usually bigger than I get in an actual security assessment. We have to have a fight over that. Don't forget that physical security and personnel security and life safety all fall into that piece too. So things like your building burning down and having a fire suppression system is actually something I should see on a security risk assessment that I often don't. But that said, a security risk assessment is just that. We have threats to the company's security posture, and these are the ways that we're dealing with those threats to the company's security posture. A compliance risk assessment is dependent, of course, on the compliance frameworks that you're driving against. HIPAA gives a great little rundown of risk assessment for a law that's that old and as poorly constructed as HIPAA is. HIPAA expects you to do a risk assessment against your healthcare delivery apparatus, your personnel within that apparatus, and the technology that drives that apparatus. So people, process, and technology need to be accompanied in your risk assessment on all aspects of service delivery as it relates to healthcare. The HIPAA risk assessment doesn't actually care about things like key man vulnerabilities, although that should pop because we're talking about operational risk. It cares more along the lines of credentialing. It cares about nursing staff levels. It cares about all of the aspects of delivering care to a patient. But note, it's all of the aspects. You can't just say you're HIPAA compliant if you haven't talked to the nursing staff about their scheduling problems and recognize that as a risk. Not really. And OCR will come down on you like a hammer. CMS is very unhappy if they come in and they discover that your breach was something like Medicare fraud because you didn't address insider threat. So just kind of keep in mind that when we talk about a compliance risk assessment, your framework that you're working against should always be pulled in to give it consideration. If you're looking at me and telling me you're doing a PCI audit, well, the risk assessment should be directed against your PCI scope. It's going to be a much smaller thing that the PCI compliance piece cares about. But if you're going to tell me you're going to do it against SOC 2, well, now we're talking organization-wide.
All right, thank you. The next one, this is coming from a manufacturing organization that sells products, and they ask, what are general organizational benefits that can be conveyed when you're trying to influence getting a compliance project approved?
Okay, so the very first thing about that, they are too numerous to number, but they go against the controls you're trying to implement. So if you're trying to implement a compliance program, then you're going to have to tailor your message of the benefits to the audience that you're going to drive. But just to give you a few things, I'm drawing on some high trust experience here, because high trust isn't just an assessment. It requires a certain amount of maturity, which implies improvements in program. But the things that I see following an assessment like that, that drives that kind of improvement for people that embrace compliance, I see improvements in process, improvements in reporting. I see a much better interdepartmental understanding of what everybody does. I see better cross-training. I see better internal understanding of your inventory of people. Who's got what skills where and who's doing what thing where becomes a really important question to answer. All of your business processes get documented in a really nice way if you're running a good compliance program. I see economies of scale. Compliance is one of those things that shines a light into the dark corners of processes. And in doing so, you start to get rid of a lot of the cruft. Bad stuff gets shoved out the door. You start to get people's confidence, and they start to report to you more often about problems. In manufacturing, in my opinion, now I'm not a big manufacturing guy, but I work with a lot of manufacturing organizations. This is what my feedback from them. In manufacturing, the biggest killer of productivity is distrust between the guy making the thing and the guy in charge of keeping tabs on him making the thing. Whoever's doing the line work, if they don't feel secure to report problems or issues or anything else up the pipe, then what invariably happens is they start to try to fix things on their own. And by the time you find out about it, it's a gigantic tangle that's costing you way more money than you ever thought it was going to cost you to begin with. It ever should have cost you walking in the door. From the other side of the fence, you're bringing up employee trust because processes get documented. People they understand what they're supposed to be doing and who they're supposed to report to and where things go. But you also start fully leveraging tools. This is a thing you see a lot in IT. We buy a tool for one purpose, it does 20 things out of the box, and then we buy another tool that mirrors something that thing does out of the box. If you want to run a good compliance program, you start asking questions of, well, why do we have 7 things to secure instead of 4 things to secure? And how do we do this better? How do we constantly improve processes? You guys are going to laugh, but the ultimate expression of a very good compliance program, one that everybody's embracing and running with and actually doing like you're supposed to, thinking ISO 9000 series here, the ultimate expression of that is people can go on vacation. Emergencies are no longer reactive. And if I'm still sounding pie in the sky, I'm not. That's what incident response is about in information security compliance. That's what incident response is about in 9000 compliance. It's about understanding what to do when things go wrong. They don't stop you anymore. If you get to the point where compliance is truly implemented, the results from it are legion. And those are the things that I hear time and time again for people that really embrace that process.
All right, next step, if your organization doesn't have an existing risk assessment, where would you suggest they start? What's the best first baby step?
There are 2 places to start. There's actually 3, and I'm going to express one. Understand that we make no, assertions about, endorsement or anything like that. However, the University of California Office of the President, UCOP, has an incredible framework with instructions for risk assessments that is generic enough to be used in any vertical. Now, they direct it against like lab space and university space, but I have never found a more off-the-shelf, absolutely wonderful worksheet and beginning process to get your risk assessment started than to use the UCOP methodology. It is directly cribbed from ISO 27005, which is another great place to start. It will put you to sleep while you're reading it, and it does cost a couple of $100 to buy their book because they're very proud of it. But the ISO methodology drives you to doing really good definitions and understandings of risk, and it does an asset-based risk assessment where it treats your employees and your processes as assets too. So it's a good driver. If cost or time is, if time is a factor, I'm going to lean you guys towards the UCOP setup. If cost is a factor, like even if getting the books from ISO and having the time to study it is difficult, I'm actually going to lean you guys towards NIST 833. It's a free framework with free underpinnings that are, if you actually follow them from the beginning, are very, very easy to understand. It actually starts a couple of letters earlier. But I will tell you this. There are any number of frameworks and big and small things that you can do to do risk assessment. Heck, you can call us. We'll be more than happy to give you a training class on how to do risk assessment, or we'll even help you do your first one. But at the end of the day, nothing beats getting some tool and just starting with it. I don't care what tool you do. I don't care what basic platform you use, but getting some basic tool, getting out there and starting the process. We can often get paralysis of choice or paralysis of difficulty, and risk assessment can be very daunting, especially your very first one. But drive your risk assessment from just the concepts that are present across the board here. What is my risk? Why do I care about it? What's its impact? What's its potential? How quick is this going to happen if we don't do anything about it? What have we already done to stop it from happening? What more do we need to do? I'm going to lean everybody towards the qualitative risk assessment in ISO 27005. It's a great place to be. And seriously, if you're just getting started, University of California, Office of the President Risk Assessment. Fantastic resource. I would also encourage you guys, because I really think you should, to go to our site at audit.kirkpatrickprice.com and take a look at the risk assessment seminars, webinars, tools, and all that we have present there. You can also talk to a guy like me. It's very easy to get in touch with an auditor there who can help you through the initial stages.
Great. We may have time for just a couple more. We have a question. Can the output of a business impact analysis from each department be an input to an organization's risk assessment?
Yes, full stop. It actually, one of the things that you should do if you're following the ISO methodology, especially in a larger business, is break out and do an impact analysis. What do these things do and how important are they is a really great question to ask before you actually dive in and say, and then what can blow them up? What can make them work not correctly? What can make us lose? The only thing I'm going to tell you on that is don't get stuck on pure assets. Make sure you bring in people, process, and technology to your impact assessment, or it is an incomplete input to your risk assessment. Still great, still better than not having one, but you really should talk about all three if you want to bring a full impact assessment to your risk assessment.
We did have someone ask if you would rename that resource again that you were just mentioning.
Other than audit.kirkpatrickprice.com, sorry guys, it's really true. It's a really great resource. University of California, Office of the President Risk Assessment, UCOP.
Great. Let me see. We may have gotten most of them. Here's one more. Would you suggest sending a risk assessment questionnaire to the entire company to get input from all possible positions?
Oh, another one where people are going to set me on fire for saying it. I'm going to tell you no. And the reason I'm going to tell you no is you're going to at best get about a 60% return unless your company is very small or unique. Now, keep in mind, if you have an organization that's very small, yeah, bring everybody in. Why not? On the other hand, if your organization is of any substantial size, you're going to get about a 60% rate of return at best. And I have discovered that only about 40% of the ones you get back are actually really at the end of the day relevant to the discussion at hand. They may be surfacing important things, but they're important things that need to be dealt with in another way. You're going to get things ranging from, I don't like the manager Sherry, she's mean and it's going to cause problems, all the way to the snack food in the, in the break room is a problem. And those might be things you do want to actually surface on the big company risk assessment. We don't have the right people. We're not treating our employees right. They need better benefits in the break room. But at the end of the day, the way I tell people to do it is take your principals in the organization, and they're the ones that get the worksheet, and their job is to go out and talk to their people. You have 1 week. I expect you to actually talk to your people and ask these questions, and I'm going to quiz you about that when you come to the meeting. And I want you to bring to me a real list of what you people are afraid of and concerned about. You're going to get much better inputs that way, and far fewer people you have to train on the whole process.
All right, last one. Can we get your opinion, Shannon, on the asset-based risk assessment and alternatives i.e. scenario-based risk assessment?
I am perfectly fine with any method of risk assessment. Don't get me wrong, asset-based is great. ISO 27005 is an asset-based risk assessment. And scenario-based is perfectly okay. The problem I have with them at the end of the day is that I have never actually encountered one in the field that was comprehensive. Asset-based risk assessments tend to be something that gets foisted off on IT or the finance department, and they want to talk about things like, we have 30 servers, what's the risk inherent in each one of those servers? And that's great, and that's fine and dandy and all the rest of it. But what about the other vulnerabilities? What about the stuff that's outside of the physical things the company owns? And so I tell you guys, your assets have to be considered across your entire environment. People, process, and technology are all company assets, and you have to drive against all of them. But being fair, how many people are actually going to sit down with a list of employees in a department and consider the risks involved in each one of those employees and their positions? Because that's what a real asset-based risk assessment takes. You break out all the positions and you say, okay, I've got this position, what's the risks? I've got this position, what's the risk? I've got this place, and what's the risk? I've got this physical location, and what's the risks? So the answer I've got for you is there's nothing wrong with them, but most of the time they don't cover all the bases. Now, I do want to stress that you can have many different risk assessments in an organization that all get pulled together as a coherent whole. I could see an asset-based risk assessment on the IT side of it, and I could see an HR person bringing me a person-based risk assessment, and I could see the C-suite bringing me an operational risk assessment. All that would be fine. You know, I can take all three of those. You're evaluating your company risk. Scenario-based is a big gotcha because most people do that around incident response or disaster recovery and consider nothing else. I do like scenario-based from the idea of establishing a threat, and in that sense, all risk assessments I've ever done, every line item, we talk about how could this come to pass. And that's one way of doing scenario-based risk assessment, and I'm all in on that. But I'm not all in on the one of, okay, the building caught fire. What are all the risks that are associated with the building catching fire? What could we lose? It may be a great way to have the conversation. It might be a great way to start the conversation, but it is by no means comprehensive across the organization.
All right, so that will be our last question. I personally learned so much, and I hope all of our attendees did as well. Thank you so much, Shannon, for taking time out of your day to share with us. As Shannon mentioned, we do have a risk assessment review that we are offering you. So if you go to audit.kirkpatrickprice.com, you can get your first review of your risk assessment reviewed for free by one of our experts. So it could be Shannon who's reviewing your policy. So definitely take us up on that. If you have any questions, let us know. On that final slide, you'll see different.
Lindsay, I want to interject one thing about that website. There's also an entire course on risk assessment that is either available there now or will be available soon. I encourage you guys to all go check it out.
Great. If we somehow missed your question, feel free to send that to hello@kirkpatrickprice.com, and we will definitely get back with you. We'd love to connect with you. Follow us on socials, email us. We want to be able to be a partner with you in your risk assessment journey, so definitely don't be a stranger. Again, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us. Take care, guys.